The community of faith is a community centered on Jesus, on knowledge and love of him. That same criteria Paul prays for the Colossian church. It's asserted here. If anything we do as a community of faith does not produce knowledge and love of God, then something needs to be addressed. And so we look at what we do. We look at the ministries of the church. We look at book clubs. How are people growing in the knowledge and love of God? We look at Sunday school and youth group. How are our kids growing in the knowledge of God and the love of Jesus? We look at our choir. In our music ministry, how are people growing in the knowledge and love of God, and how are they expressing that love to God? Just so you're aware, it's very easy for me to stand up in the pulpit as rector and talk about all the ministries of the church and ask that very pointed question and have everybody start thinking. So you're aware, that is the question that the church needs to ask of its priests, of its deacons, of its leaders, and of its bishops. How in your ministry, rector, reverend, bishop, how in your ministry are you helping us grow in the knowledge and love of God? Because that's what it's about. That's what we're about. The third thing that Paul mentions is joyfully giving thanks. Because, of course, we can't grow in the knowledge of God without growing in joyful thanks to him for what he has done. Paul writes that we are called to joyfully give thanks to the Father who has qualified us to share in the inheritance of the saints in the kingdom of light. For he rescued us from the dominion of darkness and brought us into the kingdom of the Son he loves, in whom we have redemption and the forgiveness of sins. As we live out God's will for us, God blesses us with strength and with power that we can preserve in our ministry and in our lives, so that we can joyfully give thanks, so that we can be tuned into his presence all around us and his activity and respond to that. Have you ever had the experience where you walk into a room and you recognize the scent of your loved one, whether it's their perfume or whether it's their cologne, but you recognize just in some way the presence that they were there, that some evidence that they were there. You recognize, you're so tuned into the life of the one that you love that you recognize that. For me, it's often a path of destruction that follows me wherever I go. See, what Paul is saying is when we give thanks, we're tuned into God's presence. Just like being tuned into the activity of a loved one. So too, living out God's will for us involves recognizing God's presence and God's activity here. Because here's the thing about the will of God for the church. It doesn't happen by memo. It's not a divine download. God didn't send us a note and say, I want you to do this. Go about it, and I'll send you another note when said activity A is done. That's not what the will of God is. The will of God is inseparable from God's presence. God doesn't send a note. God gives us his presence and says, I'm going this way. I want you to follow me. I want you to come along. See, one of the interesting things about this reading, about the three things that Paul talks about in terms of living in the will of God, is that they all flow together. We can't do the work of the church. We can't produce fruit of good works and not find ourselves growing deeper in knowledge and love of God. And when we grow in knowledge and love of God, and when we see God's activity around us, how can we not give thanks to him? So Paul really doesn't put forward anything radical here. Paul's prayer is pretty much that the church, just be the church. Just get to the task of being the church. We live in a world which is very complex. And church today can sometimes feel pulled in so many different directions. Right? There's this stuff we need to comment on, and there's this controversy we need to deal with, and then there's this we're trying to struggle through, and then there's so many different things. And I was thinking throughout this week, because apparently down south there's a really big election happening on Wednesday, and through the internet and social media and Facebook and Twitter and all this stuff, there's all these comments that link kind of the whole politics stuff and faith. Being a Christian person means voting this way. Interestingly, the other side says being a Christian person means voting this way. Right? Maybe what we need to do is pray that the church just start again being the church. Let's just get to the task at hand. Let's just see God's presence in the midst of us and follow that and joyfully give thanks for what he has done. Just like the church in Colossae, I think it's wonderful to know and to say that God has a will, and God has a plan, and God has a divine intention for this church. Just like God said that you may know God's will. You know, God has a will for the church in the Colossian people. God has a will there. God has a will for us. There is a divine intention to who we are to be, to what we are to do in ministry, to the various ways that he has called us to grow, to expand, to bear fruit. So just as Paul prays that the church be the church, let's make that our prayer for us here at Holy Cross. Let's remember that our role here is not to think up the latest strategy of ministry and mission, but rather we are to receive it. We are to receive all our direction from the God who dwells within us, or with us. Let's hold before us, especially in this stewardship time, that the health of the church exists not in butts in the seats and dollars in the plate. That's not what it's about. The health of the church exists in people growing in relationship with Christ. It's what we are about. That's who we are to be. And above all, let us remember that one of the most glorious duties that we have as a church, as a community of faith, is to render our thanks to the God who not only redeems us, but also sustains us in every place and work of our lives. Amen.